and co-founder of DLA Ignite. Today I've got with me Isaac Sacolick, and we're going to talk about his book, or a number of things. We're going to talk about his book, Digital Trailblazer, and we're going to talk about transformational leadership, especially in the digital world. Before we dive into it, Isaac, tell people where they get hold of you.
I'm all over the place. You can find me on Twitter at NYIke, I-K-E. I have a blog with over 500 posts on it. That's at blogs.starcio.com. And I have a YouTube channel, The Driving Digital Stand-Up.
And you are very active on LinkedIn as well, aren't you?
Yes, of course. You'll see me posting my latest articles from my blog, from my YouTube channel, from the articles I write for InfoWorld. I'm speaking typically about 50 events every year, and I share.
Say that in the book. That's quite amazing.
Yeah, I mean, between webinars and in-person events, it adds up. I actually keep a database of it all.
I can imagine, having read your book, I can imagine that you do actually. So I've read it and I really enjoyed it. And I know that when we talked in the preparation call, one of the things that you said, I hope you don't mind me saying this, was you actually found it quite difficult to get a publisher. And the reason for it is actually the strength. I've written a business book. It's about business. What this is actually you talk about the scenarios of, we're at a startup, we've got to do this, or we're at you worked at a publisher who suddenly realized that they were being hit by digital, and rather than selling ads on newspapers, you were going to put them on a website. And how do you scale that up really, really quickly, and build all that? And that was the question. And then what you do is you in effect you say this in the book, that you as the reader are there in the boardroom with you as you're presenting to the various people, and then you give advice. So tell us what was the inspiration behind this?
Well, it came in waves. I would say the first was, coming off my first book, Driving Digital. That is a more playbook. Here's what I've done as a leader to lead Agile, or to bring DevOps into an organization, or how to really structure an Agile product management organization, and how to change the culture. So that was a playbook. And coming off of that, I did speaking, I did a lot of workshops. And what I found was just the people most interested in the material, who were asking really tough questions, were people that I labeled aspiring transformation leaders. They were product managers, they were developers, they were in DevOps, they were data scientists. They kind of saw and understood their narrow lens of the world that they were working in. They had participated in transformation programs, but they really didn't see sort of the other side of how their collaboration, who they collaborated with, and how to bring a transformation program to fruition. How do you plan it? How do you get support for it? How do you actually take a technology and actually see it impacting the business? And so a lot of my workshops started talking about that. And I thought about this for a while. I said, well, how do I accelerate their learning around this? And I knew just, being prescriptive, there's so much you could learn from a playbook and so much you could learn from a workshop. But I lived through some very interesting ups and downs. I tell some of my hero stories. I tell a lot of my painful stories, my difficult times doing things. And, I said, let me see if I can help people learn from my experiences. And that's about half of what you get out of the book. The other half is, I made it explicit, and I wanted to make sure that if you read a chapter, you knew what the lessons learned were. And so I left every chapter with 5 lessons learned. So there's a total of 50 of them in the book.
And what I think there's, when we talk about transformation, I think it's one of the chapters at the end where you talk about, if you're working in an organization, it doesn't matter what size it is. If you're going to do transformation, there's only so much an organization can take on. Therefore, you need to prioritize it. But it's not just about going to the board and saying, this is this year's priority. because they may throw that out. It's about having a set of, say, 5 priorities. But what you're doing is that you're leading. When you come next year, you'll go, well, do you remember last year I talked about this? And it's not just about coming and presenting the solution. It's about making sure that you're setting up success going forward. Am I explaining it properly?
You are, but let me give you some nuances to it.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're talking to the board,
Yeah.
right, it's very important for the board to see everything, right?
Mhm.
You know, you're representing opportunities, you're representing also a lot of risk as a CIO or someone working in data or technology in general. So, you know, the board needs to have complete visibility. These are all the things that we probably should be working on. And then you need to be able to sell, you know, management's opinion. These are the things that we want to focus on, that we think it's realistic to focus on. We're going to peel the onion in layers because we know that the organization can only handle a certain amount of transformation at any given time.
Yep.
We know we can execute on maybe 2, 3, 4, however many things we think we can execute on. But if we spread our resources against 40 of them, and there's 200 people who can really drive change and transformation, we know we're going to be spread too thin. We're not going to really get the impact that we're looking for. And so, yes, you do lead it to a prioritization, and part of it is understand what the organization can absorb once you start transforming, and part of it is how much can you realistically execute too. And so you got to play both hats as a leader, being able to express both of them.
There's one story you tell about you went into an environment that was, the CEO had said, this is really important to us. And I can't remember how I can't remember if you were new in job or something. And then you went and spoke to the development team, and they weren't anywhere near delivering on the timescales. And then when you started basically peeling it all, you realized that the technology platform didn't work, and I mean, it was, I can imagine it was pretty scary, basically, coming across that and finding all that.
It was, you know, it is a little scary because, you know, you're kind of being a scientist and anthropologist. You're walking into a project that has some issues, and you know that's very common in any organization. You might have been there for a long time and saying, look, this project isn't executing. How do I really unravel what some of the root causes were? When you're new to the organization and they've already made an investment, they've already sold the concept in, and you're coming in as an outsider and you're saying, I got to do some course corrections here. That, you know, sometimes it leads to a lot of angst, a lot of, you know, question marking, and you're putting a lot of onus on yourself to say, look, I think you did these things right, you did some of these things wrong, and these are the areas that I need to do a course correction in. You know, the story you're telling there, I did make a technology change.
Yep.
And you know, that was one of the things that I thought was important, but I didn't change partners. We stayed with the same partner that we were developing with. They were doing agile. We ended up enhancing how they were practicing agile. We changed the scope of how we were working. Really, the heart of the problem there was a gap in user experience. It was a product owner who had thought he had a pretty good idea of what end users wanted and created a picture that was very difficult for the technology team to execute on. And it turned out when you brought voice of customer into that equation, you got a very different picture over what they were looking for. And, you know, at the end of that chapter, I tell, you know, we went off as a group and launched 5 products together over, I think it was about 18 months. So once we got, you know, the collaboration together of how to work together, how to think through technology, user experience, data, agile, then we really started executing. You know, other times I've walked into situations, you know, I walked into another one. I didn't tell this story fully in the book, but I walked into another one. They had already chosen a platform. They were already starting to execute on it. It would not have been a platform I selected, but it didn't matter. I learned from the experience. I said, look, we're going to make this thing work. We ended up launching 2 products out of that product. It had some things that excelled well and some things that didn't excel well. So, I mean, whenever you walk into a situation, you really have to recognize that you come in with your pre-existing knowledge, whether it's process or technology or leadership. Those, that's your history, but you have to learn what the organization is trying to do, what its culture is, who their experiences are, what the technologies are, and you're probably going to continually have to adapt and change your approach based on the circumstances that you're in.
Yeah, I thought you were. I mean, I learned a lot from that chapter, which was the one. The fact that if someone's already chosen a technology, they probably already have gone through quite a process in their heads to actually buy into something because they've made a selection in some shape or form. And you very diplomatically stepped around that. The other one was about the use of agile. I'm no way an agile expert. I can hardly spell it, let alone know anything about it. But the fact that you went in and you actually made sure that they were, as you said, some directions of change in terms of the way that they were using agile. And it seemed to me as if that by using agile in that particular way, they were then getting more out of it, because you were talking about the stand-ups and stuff in the morning, and the fact that you changed that and changed the timescale on that.
Yeah, I mean, agile is a pretty wide spectrum of process and mindset. There's on one side, there's kind of fundamental Scrum that people could read in hundreds of blogs and books, and running stand-ups and having sprint reviews and retrospectives and, prioritizing backlogs and writing user stories. And then, as you kind of go down the expertise and how you get agile working with more groups and how do you have groups coordinating, there's a lot of different frameworks and guidebooks out there that do this. And, what I remind people in both my books and on my blog and in the work I do at Star CIO is, every company is different. You have people coming in from different backgrounds. Sometimes it's 3 groups working together. They're co-located. In the last 2 years, we've had those same 3 groups distributed, sometimes, working from home. Sometimes you got one group in one part of the country, one group in another part of the country. You might be working on workflow for the office and employee experience. You might be doing customer experiences in highly innovative experimental areas, so that, you might be in regulated areas, you might be in open areas. There's a lot of variables that go into a process that we just come up with this one word called agile. And, the nice thing about the manifesto that was written 22 years ago is pretty open. It's a mindset, it's a way of thinking. But then what I remind people is it's about people in that company coming together as leadership and saying, this is what agile means in this organization. This is our way of running agile. These are the things that we're going to focus on. And I find that organizations that adapt that way of thinking really excel at it. When you think about, how do I get the value out of process investment, out of the training that goes into this, and if you're building customer facing product, for example, maybe it makes sense to call the person who's leading the effort a product manager and a product owner. But if I'm doing something internally and I'm building services out and internal technology, maybe I want to call it a service manager. And that person's doing the same role, but it's called something completely different. That's just an example of organizations coming together and figuring out what their way of working is, and not just trying to go and saying, you know what, we're going to holistically adopt framework X, get some consultants here, figure out how to make it work, and kind of like bulldoze it into our round peg into a square hole, and then find out it's not working for us.
And what was the term that you said that you'd heard people saying, that's not agile?
That's not agile. Yeah.
That's not agile. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of came up far more than I ever expected it to. And it comes, from this mindset that when you invest in learning how to do something, particularly whether it's agile or DevOps, you kind of learn how to run that bicycle and you slowly become an expert around it. And that's how you expect things to run. And so, when I started Agile 15 16 years ago, the hard thing was taking no process and bringing agile in, or taking waterfall project management mindset and bringing agile in. There was a lot of learning on the basic kind of one-on-one on how to run the process. Today, you bring 50, 60, 200 people into a room. They all know agile. Some of them are the experts, have done it for their own 10, 15 years of the career. And you're coming in and saying, let's figure this out together. Well, they don't want to figure it out together. They want to do what's worked for them in the past. And so it's very common for them to come up and say things like, that's not agile. And, I do a lot of that in the book because, again, I've done startups, I've done enterprises, I've done customer facing, I've done internal facing, and I'm always rewriting the playbook from a set of guides that I've started with, but I'm always rewriting the playbook and saying, look, let's figure out what makes sense here. How are we going to execute? What are we trying to accomplish? Do we want to focus on requirements writing because we're really weak at that? Do we want to focus on estimating? So, you think about agile as a collection of processes. Every organization is going to sequence them and mature them in a different order depending on what opportunities and problems they're trying to solve for.
One of the stories that I liked as well was when you met the people in marketing, and what they were doing was putting spreadsheets together. They were taking a list and putting it into a spreadsheet, and then you said, well, here's some Tableau dashboards. What do you think to this? And I went, can we do that?
Yeah, I love that sort of magical first time when somebody who has the capability of doing something in technology recognizes that they can actually do it, that they don't have to ask for it and wait, never see it, or ask for it, and when they see it, it's not exactly what they pictured. These are people who, have technology acumen. They've been born and raised and lived through digital technology their entire lives. They just don't want to be in IT. They want to be in marketing, or they want to be in finance or operations, but they know how to do certain things. And some of them quite a bit. I mean, there's Python programmers out there. We're not just talking low code and no code anymore. We're talking real coding being done outside of IT. And I'm a CIO. That's a good thing, right? There's so much funding and skill that I can have inside the IT group. It's usually, whatever, 3, 5, 7% of the company's budget going into IT. Part of it is just keeping operations on. How am I going to innovate? How am I going to compete? How am I going to become more data driven? Well, I'm not just going to do it inside the walls of IT. I'm going to need citizen developers outside of IT. I'm going to need really good partnerships with expertise when I'm working with emerging technologies. But my favorite thing, Tim, is when you go to somebody outside of IT and you give them tools and you give them practices and you give them ways of doing things, and then they start becoming self-sufficient with technology. Wow, you really have an eye-awakening moment when that happens.
And I love the fact that you welcoming to that, because I think that empowerment, you rattled off a number of things. How do we compete? How do we innovate? And those things don't necessarily come from IT, because, as you say, what you're doing is that you're keeping the lights on of the payroll system and the accounting system, and you're not necessarily going, well, actually, what we need to do is to do this in marketing, and we need to bring this data in here and clean it up.
Remember, Tim, remember, everybody has their day jobs. Marketers are creating material and doing events and bringing leads in. That's their day-to-day jobs. And, finance has got to put out a report once a month, once a quarter, and, get checks out the door and things like that. We all have our run jobs. And so when you start thinking about, well, I want to do something that's going to transform how we're going to work. I want to do something that's going to potentially experiment with a new experience in front of customers. We're actually going to put technology in front of customers for the very first time. It's not going to just be technologists or marketers or people in operations figuring this out. This is going to take a collaboration. This is going to take this group coming together and say, you know what, we're going to throw that dart maybe a couple weeks ahead. and figure out what is it that we can do that's going to make an impact, that's going to give us more confidence in what we're doing, that's going to give us some learning and something that we can share back to our stakeholders and our customers. And we're going to do that in a finite period of time so that we can actually see the end result and then course correct in terms of priority, or course correct in terms of how we're planning around something. And that's really the heart of Agile, right? The heart of Agile saying, I think I can figure out what I'm going to do in the next 2 weeks. Maybe I have an idea what's the next 4 to 8 weeks. I have aspirations for the next 12 to 24 weeks, but tell me what I'm going to do Q2 in 2023. I have some ideas around that, but I'm not really sure. We're going to have to walk until we get there, and then I'll have some more confidence around that.
Isaac, thank you so much for coming on today and talking about the book, Digital Trailblazer. I really enjoyed it. Maybe because I haven't worked in IT, but I've dealt with IT people for a long time, so I kind of understand it. But as I said in my review on Amazon, if you're either an IT leader or an aspiring IT leader, it's a really great read, and I really enjoyed it, and I'd certainly recommend it.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, this is a book that reads like a novel, like you said in your review. It's stories, and when you get to the end of the chapter, you're going to get those lessons learned. I have a whole digital Trailblazer community that you get access to with the book, and so you get access to me. You get to ask me questions all the time. So hope you pick up a copy, read it, reach out to me at NYIke on Twitter. And Tim, thanks for having me.
You're welcome, Isaac. It's been fantastic, and thank you for coming on. It's great book, and appreciate you coming and sharing your experience.
Thank you.